Hello students, today I'm going to cover some common midterm mistakes that I've seen after teaching several versions of this class. And so hopefully you will receive higher grades on the midterm than previous students because you will avoid these common mistakes. Okay, so first, a real common mistake I see is just in the explanation of the data. So this is in the data info section of the calculations. And let me give you an example of something that I actually saw in one of my, in a previous midterm. I saw something like this. So somebody was doing one of their calculations. This was in a COVID topic. And the student said, all right, for the data info, there were 4,173 deaths and 247,641 cases. And this should immediately, to me, this immediately looked strange. So one, I'm recording this in March of 2021. And at that point, there are over 500,000 deaths in the US due to COVID. So this claim that there are 4,173 deaths, it's like, what is this talking about? So my immediate questions are like, where? Or is this data for the whole US? Is this data for a certain state or some city or something like that? And when? Maybe this information is really old. Maybe this is a year-old information back when the pandemic was just getting started. And what's the source? I can't even check where these numbers are coming from to see what the data actually means. So something like this for the data info, even though it does say something about what the numbers mean, this is in no way adequate and definitely gets no points for the data info section. So, all right, let's do better. What's the correct way to present the data here? Well, turns out these numbers are coming from Orange County, California. And so here's a correct way to represent this data. You say, all right, 4,173 total people died due to COVID in Orange County, California by March 6, 2021. And 247,641 people had been infected by the coronavirus in Orange County, California by March 6, 2021. And then here's a source that actually says it, and that source came from, it was an article published March 6th. So this is great. Now I understand whether this is relevant or not. Depends on what you do with this data. So certainly it's relevant to COVID, but is it relevant to understanding race in COVID? If you're from Orange County, California, then all right, these numbers might be important to you. And if this is coupled with demographic data about race in Orange County, California, then it absolutely can be relevant. But if you use this information to do some calculations that have nothing to do with race, then okay, you might still get dinged on the relevance of this. But at least the data information portion is correct. This says everything I need. The numbers are explained exactly, and the source is given so that I can check if it seems like if it seems like what you're saying doesn't make sense, I can go check. Okay. Here's something that is really specific to the COVID one. So if you're choosing race and criminal justice, this might not be as relevant to you. The last one, the data info, I saw there were issues with the race and criminal justice one too, in terms of like arrests and where they're coming from and things like that. But this one, okay, this is very specific to the COVID one. A lot of students very rightly went to the CDC for information. And a lot of students found something like this on the CDC's website. And so I actually, I give the source here of where I took this screenshot from, and this is from March 8th, 2021. So, okay, good start going to the CDC. I mean, this is where any news source is going to get its information from too. So you might as well go to the original source yourself and understand the data. It gives you raw numbers, and it gives you percents. This seems good. And it is, so long as you know what you're doing. So let me show you a common mistake that students who did the COVID and criminal justice topic, a common mistake that I saw. Let's just look at this here, these numbers for Hispanic and Latino population. So this is in the deaths by race and ethnicity category. And so I saw a lot of students say something like this. This says that the Hispanic and Latino deaths due to COVID is 34,689. And so let me pause and ask, is it true? Is this what the data is telling us? Is it true that 34,689 Hispanic or Latino people have died of the coronavirus in the US? And I'm going to say, no, that's not what this is telling us. So let's be careful. We got to read this section up here. This is taking data from 381,950 deaths, which is already not the total number of deaths. Whoops. So the total number of deaths in March of 2021 was over 500,000. So this is data from a subset of the total number of deaths. And then this is saying that the race and ethnicity data was available for, of these 381,000 deaths, the race and ethnicity data was only available for 285,000 of those deaths. So 74% of the deaths where we had any data at all, 74% of those deaths we had race and ethnicity data. And so what this number is actually telling us is that out of the 285,181 deaths where race and ethnicity data was available, out of that subset of the total deaths, 34,689 were Hispanic or Latino. And as I said, as of March 8th, 2021, there were over 500,000 deaths in the US due to the coronavirus. So actually, the total number of Hispanic Latino deaths due to coronavirus is likely much higher. If you want to have an estimate of what the total number of Hispanic Latino deaths are, you can use this information to help with that. This is saying this is where this percent number is going to be better to use in your calculation than this total number. Because this is saying, well, the data we have, it looks like 12.2% of the deaths are due to COVID. Deaths due to COVID are in the Hispanic Latino population. And then you can say somewhere else on the CDC's website, find the estimate for the total number of deaths in the US due to COVID, multiply that by 12.2%, and that could give you an estimate for the total number of Hispanic Latino deaths. And it's going to be much bigger than 34,689, sadly. So, okay, like I said, this was just a lot of people on the COVID and race topic ended up here for very good reasons, and then ended up misinterpreting this data. So I just wanted to nip that one in the bud. Okay, here's another super common mistake on both topics, and it has to do with rates. And this is kind of, I guess, once again, understanding your data and what it's actually telling you. But let's look at an example. So here's a good example of a data info. This gets full points. Say, according to the Department of Justice, which is a great source for data in the if you're doing race and criminal justice. So according to the Department of Justice, here's a link. In 2019, there were 7,014,550 white people were arrested in the US. And 2,667,010 Black people were arrested in the US. Okay, so this data information is good. Now, let me ask you a question. Given this data, which race is arrested at a higher rate? A, white Americans are arrested at a higher rate. Black Americans are arrested at a higher rate. Or C, you don't have enough information to say who's arrested at a higher rate. So I want you to think about this. Given the data info, which one of these is correct? The correct answer is C. You just don't have enough information. So this is a huge problem I saw. Is say multiple midterms, students had the data info right, and then, but I guess it didn't quite know what that data info was telling them, or were mistaken in terms of what you can conclude from this data. And so when it comes to arrest rates, this isn't enough to tell you about arrest rates. In order to know about arrest rates, you have to know the total number of white and black people in the US. So, I mean, sure, this says more white people were arrested than black people in the US. But that's to be expected because there are just more white people than black people in the US. And so, in order to kind of understand these numbers, you have to look at the total populations and compare the number of arrests to the total population. So let's do that. So while that data info from before, I just copied it over, was correct, it's not enough information. So really you should add something else about getting the total population. Now, what I had to do when I was looking at this, I went to the US Census Bureau, which is, I think it's a natural place to go for this information. And according to the US Census Bureau, at this website, it gave the total US population, which was about 328 million. And it didn't break down the total number of white and black people in the US in 2019. But it did give percents, and it said, okay, 76.3% of the total population was white, and 13.4% of the total population was black. So, okay, let's calculate arrest rates. Now we have enough information. Let's see how a calculation would go. Again, I'm using an example from race and criminal justice, but similar issues were showing up in the race and COVID. And so let's go through this, and you could do, because you could do similar things about death rates in white and black populations due to COVID, as opposed to arrest rates in white and black populations. So this is good no matter what your topic was to pay attention to. So if you want to calculate arrest rates, first, all right, you got to find the total white population of the US in 2019. And so to do that, we take this 328 million number, which was the total population, and multiply it by 0.763, which comes from the percent of the total population that is white. And so 76.3% of 328 million is this 250 million number. So this says in 2019, the total white population was about 250 million. And now let's do the same for the black population. So in 2019, the black population in the US was about, we take this total population and now multiply it by 0.134, because 13.4% of the population was black in 2019. And so we do that, and the total number of black people in the population is looks like about 44 million. Okay, now we've got total number of white people arrested in the total white population, total number of black people arrested in the total black population. Now we can calculate arrest rates. So let's see. So in 2019, the white arrest rate was, all right, the number of arrested white people divided by the total number of white people. If you do that calculation, you get about 0.028. So the 2019 arrest rate for white people in the US was 2.8%. And now let's do the same for the Black population. So in 2019, the Black arrest rate, we calculate that by taking the total number of Black people arrested divided by the total number of Black people in the population, which is 0.061. So we get 6.1%. So even though originally we couldn't tell, more white people were arrested than Black people in the US. But even though that's true, it turns out that actually white people are arrested at about half the rate that Black people are in the US. And so, all right, this is something to, be careful about when you are doing these calculations. The relative populations just matter if you want to understand underlying trends. Okay. Here's another example of, problems that I saw, both topics. And this has to do with ratios. So, okay, let's use that same data information that we just had from before, the total number of white people arrested and total number of Black people arrested in 2019. So here's a calculation that I saw very similar to, again, some things I saw in the COVID topic as well. I'd see people say, oh, all right, here's my calculation. The ratio of white to Black arrests in the US is 7,014,550 to 2,667,013. Whoops, there's a typo. That should be a 0. And okay, in one sense, this is true, but it's not really a calculation. I mean, all that happened here was that you took two numbers and then you just wrote them as a ratio, but this is not a calculation. And this gets no points for a calculation. But even more than that, it's not even very enlightening. Like this, how does taking these two numbers and writing them like this, how does that help you understand race and COVID better? Or sorry, race and criminal justice better? It doesn't. It doesn't. I mean, just people are not great at comparing 6-7 digit numbers. What people are good at comparing is like 1 and 2 digit numbers. So here's a better ratio calculation to do with this information. Say, instead of writing it as in colon notation right away, all right, write it as in fraction notation and do this division. Say, all right, take the 7 million divided by the 2,667,000. If you do this, you get the number 2.6. And so this ratio, 7 million to 2.67 million, is about 2.6 to 1. And so now you say, all right, one, you've actually done a calculation. And now you can turn this calculation into a ratio and say, oh, okay, what have you done? You've calculated that the ratio of white to Black arrests is about 2.6 to 1. Good. Okay, like that's a calculation. It's useful. It is much easier to understand this 2.6 to 1 than 7 million to 2,667,000. And so, this is a good strategy if you're doing ratios and you have these big numbers, convert them to a unit ratio. Okay, I think this is the last common mistake. So, all right, let's say you've got your data information handled. You've got your calculation handled. So you're getting full credit on both of these. Let's talk about correct and incorrect interpretations of this data. So let's see. I want you to think about this. This ratio 2.6 to 1. Is this a correct interpretation? For every black person arrested in the US, there are on average 2.6 white people arrested in the US. Yes. This is a good interpretation of the data. This number on top here, the 7 million, that was white people arrested. 2,667,000, that was black people arrested. 2.6 is 2.6 over 1. This ratio of 2.6 to 1 is the ratio of white people arrested to black people arrested. And that really is the case, that if one black person is arrested, or for every one black person arrested, about 2.6 white people are arrested. True. How about this? There are 2.6 times as many white people arrested in the US as black people. Also true. That's what this is saying. So do you have enough information to conclude that the criminal justice system is biased against white people, since there are 2.6 times as many white people arrested in the US as black people? If you were paying attention to previous slides, you would know that the answer is no. We don't have enough information. Again, to make progress on, say, answering the question about bias, you need to know these numbers relative to the total population. Again, okay, yeah, 2.6 times as many white people as black people were arrested in the US. But there are way more white people than black people in the US, so you'd expect there to be more white people arrested than black people arrested. And if you want to, instead of looking at rates, be looking at ratios, then the relevant ratio to compare is, say, all right, well, number of white people arrested, black people arrested is 2.6 to 1. And you should compare this to the ratio of white people to black people on the total population, which is about 5.7 to 1. So, okay, in the total population, for every one black person, there are almost 6 white people. But in the arrested population, for every black person, there are fewer than 3 white people. And so this also indicates, actually, that the arrest rates for white people to black people, the arrest rates for white people is about half the arrest rate for black people. So, okay. Now, what you want to conclude about all this, speculating as to why this is all true, like that, you save that for your summary, and you are not graded on the angle that you take on it. You're not graded on the, on what political opinions you want to express. That's totally fine. You can take this as a chance to, say how you feel about things. And in the summary, what I grade you on is not the angle you take on it. What I'm grading you on is, are you at least trying to engage with these numbers? Like, are you doing calculations that helped you learn something? What did you learn? And on the calculation part, I just want you to not say something false in the interpretation. Like, your interpretation in the calculation section should be neutral. Just, what is this telling you? And saying that tells you that there are 2.6 times as many white people arrested in the US as black people? Yes. Saying something like the white people arrested at a rate of 2.6 times that of black people? No. So, okay. Hopefully this has been helpful. Hopefully you won't fall into these pitfalls. And I'm really hopeful that grades are going to be higher on this than they were in my previous versions of this class. I would say previous versions of this class, the average grade on the midterm was about a 78%. So I'm hoping to get that average into the B range this time. Okay. Thanks for listening. I'm excited to see what your minds produce on this.